Good evening, Little Masters, and welcome to episode 348 of the Prancing Pony Podcast, where we are currently laying siege by sea and land to Umbar.
When you are slain in the battle with fresh hordes of Easterlings, I promise I will avenge you.
Yeah, sure you will.
Hey, come on now. I'll at the very least mourn. Folks, pull up a bench in the common room and join us. I am Don Marshall, known as the obscure Lord of the Rings facts guy, and I am here with the Man of the West, whose might no enemy would dare to contest during the remainder of his long reign. Alan Sisto.
Wait a minute, are you saying that the PPP has reached the summit of its power? Is it all downhill from here, Don?
I'm here right now. That's all I'll say.
Oh, fair enough. All right. Well, folks, join us as we look at great kings, lazy kings, and usurpers in our look at the first part of Appendix A1, Little 4 this time. We're making progress, covering the Kingdom of Gondor.
Don't mind me, I'm just playing with precious stones like pebbles. Folks, no matter how you arrived, you are all welcome here in the common room at the Prancing Pony Podcast, where we are reading and talking our way through Middle-earth with plenty of speculation and some bad dad jokes along the way.
Well, I was going to say we'll try to avoid those, but come on, we're not.
Yeah.
We do love our deep dives into the lore, discussing our favorite themes, and a whole lot more.
But we do try to keep it light and fun. Think of this like a couple of friends chatting at the pub. We're very glad you've joined us.
Indeed, and I'm sure you'll be glad you joined as well. But before we get to tonight's chapter discussion, it's time for a segment I always enjoy, Kingly Gifts. Back in episode 327 with James Tauber last season, he and I talked about what was the biggest news so far this year in Tolkien publishing, and that was the scheduled release of a 3-volume set of the collected poems of J.R.R. Tolkien, edited by none other than Christina Scull and Wayne G. Hammond. Now, I pre-ordered it the minute that I could, and it finally arrived last week, just in time for me to look over it, read a handful of poems, and put together a few thoughts on it.
Famously, Alan, I do have to call you out on this. You have talked at length about skipping the poetry in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit for quite a long time. So yeah. What has changed? What's going on?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, obviously doing this podcast is what changed it initially. I mean, it was one of those things where, yes, as a reader in my younger days, I often skipped the poetry. It turns out, though, I'm not the only one. In fact, on the very first page of the very long introduction from Scull and Hammond, the introduction is 55 pages long and worth every second, they write that there is ample anecdotal evidence that many who enjoy his stories of Middle-earth pass over the poems very quickly or avoid them altogether, either in haste to get on with the prose narrative or because they dislike poetry in general or think they do.
I loved that line. For me, at least, when I was young, I read it, definitely skipped over a decent amount of it, probably should not have. But going back and listening to the audiobook version of it, it does add a nice sort of levity to the story. It's quite nice.
Well, sometimes levity and sometimes, I'm thinking of maybe the recitation of the names of the people who died in the Battle of the Pelennor Fields in Rohirric verse. You know, I mean, there's emotional moments in these poems. Yeah.
There really are. And Hammond and Scull continue on basically saying that those who skip the poetry, it's their loss, for they are missing elements integral to the story which help drive their plots and contribute to character and mood. Those who hurry past Tolkien's poems are also foregoing the simple emotional pleasure one often finds in the reading of verse.
You know, I've finally come to see how true that is. For me, I get the most emotional pleasure, if you will, from alliterative verse. And there's just something about it. I'm not having to listen quite as closely to the rhyme and to the meter. Well, sometimes to the meter, but I'm listening instead for the flow of a narrative story. And the alliteration just sort of hits and highlights various things. I love that. But yeah, definitely a lot of it is integral to the story, and they drive the plot forward. And that's not just in The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, but even in some of the other works. Of course, those of us who have skipped the poetry are in good company. Tolkien himself wrote in On Fairy Stories that when he was a child, he was insensitive to poetry and skipped it if it came in tales. Thank you very much. I think we're done here, right? And yet there's a 3-volume set, so clearly he would go on to discover a love of poetry. And that happened actually in his classics studies, particularly when he had to translate English poems into Latin and Greek.
I don't really blame him for that one either. And just as some might skip the poetry, there are some fans of the poetry who might skip the 55-page introduction just to get to the good stuff. But, as I think Alan will tell you, don't do that.
Don't do that. Bad idea.
It really helps provide some context for Tolkien's poetry, particularly his early work in the context of his life.
Yeah.
Also, each entry in the collected poems is accompanied by commentary and, more often than not, variants of the poems so that we get to see the development of Tolkien's work over time. But let's talk about the physical books themselves before we get into the actual poetry.
All right. Well, the 3 volumes covering 1910 to 1919, then 1919 to 1931, and finally 1931 to 1967. Each volume is about 500 pages. They're beautiful hardcover volumes. They don't actually have dust jackets. I think that was the right call. The covers themselves have these gorgeous Tolkien illustrations, little gold foil title and a faux Tolkien signature on them. They're really pretty, and they come in a very solid slipcase that has the same 3 pieces of Tolkien art that are on the covers of the books on the sides and backs, so you don't lose sight of those even when they're in the slipcase. The case is exactly the right size. I do have to say, sometimes cases are a little too tight, and it's really hard to get a book out with either damaging the dust jacket or the spine of the book, or maybe just the slipcase itself. And frankly, as much as I like the books, I'm looking at you, recent box sets of the History of Middle-earth. Very hard to get those out sometimes. But that's not a problem with this set. Now, of course, each volume features one of Tolkien's illustrations, like we talked about, as well as dark blue end papers and a dark blue ribbon marker, as well as a 2-sided color plate reproduction of the actual writing or type of one of Tolkien's poems. So it's a really nice set of volumes. Now, the paper is nice enough, too. It's not too thin, it's not too translucent, and the contrast is really good. I ordered mine from the UK, so it's the HarperCollins set, but it should be identical to the William Morrow set that you'd buy from a US source, given that William Morrow, of course, is owned by HarperCollins.
And we want to mention something. While there are 195 entries, there are more like 240 individual separate poems spread across the 3 volumes, at least 50 of which have never been published before, and others which have only been published in very rare, sort of long out-of-print specialist volumes. And the appendices are filled with some really fun treasures, like limericks, as well as some very helpful word lists and the glossary that will help you when Tolkien decides to use, as he often does, those really archaic words.
That actually is very helpful, I have to say. Now, while we can't possibly have read all 3 volumes in 1,500 pages between the time I got the books and tonight's recording, I have at least had an opportunity to look at a few, and I thought I'd share part of one. It's actually the very first entry, entitled Morning. The version I'll read an excerpt from was written in a letter to Edith Bratt on March 28, 1910. This is after Tolkien had been forbidden to see her or communicate with her by his guardian, Father Francis Morgan. So he wasn't able to give her this poem until they were reunited 3 years later. The poem is 22 lines long, and I'll just read the last 7. But wake, dear sweet gray eyes, for though a song of day doth rise from glad earth to God above, for me drear night is o'er only when in joy once more I clasp thee to me, little one, and the day again's begun in thy morning kiss of love. Is that just the sweetest?
That's so nice.
I love that.
I love that so much. Very cool.
It's just so tender. I love it.
Now, of course, there are far too many poems for us to look at here in an introductory segment. We'll create an entirely different podcast for that. But as we read through, please don't be surprised if we bring one to you every now and again, especially the ones that are connected to Middle-earth, like the Voyage of Eärendil, the Evening Star, or the Horde.
That's right. Long story short, if you found yourself enjoying any of the poetry in The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, or if you liked seeing the development of his work in the history of Middle-earth, I think you'll enjoy the collected poems of J.R.R. Tolkien, and it really does belong on any Tolkien collector's shelf.
And you know what else belongs on your shelf?
What's that?
The next part that you're about to read in the book you're about to read. Alan,
all right.
Would you take it away?
In the appendices. I will indeed. It was Ostaher the 7th king who rebuilt Minas Anor, where afterwards the kings dwelt in summer rather than in Osgiliath. In his time, Gondor was first attacked by wild men out of the east, but Torostar, his son, defeated them and drove them out, and took the name of Romendikil, East Victor. He was, however, later slain in battle with fresh hordes of Easterlings. Turambar, his son, avenged him, and won much territory eastwards. With Tyrannon, the 12th king, began the line of the ship kings, who built navies and extended the sway of Gondor along the coasts west and south of the mouths of Anduin. To commemorate his victories as captain of the hosts, Tyrannon took the crown in the name of Falastur, Lord of the Coasts. Eärendil I, his nephew who succeeded him, repaired the ancient haven of Pelargir and built a great navy. He laid siege by sea and land to Umbar and took it, and it became a great harbor and fortress of the power of Gondor. But Eärnil did not long survive his triumph. He was lost with many ships and men in a great storm off Umbar. Ciriandil, his son, continued the building of ships, but the men of the Harad, led by the lords that had been driven from Umbar, came up with great power against that stronghold, and Ciriandil fell in battle in Haradwaith. For many years Umbar was invested, but could not be taken because of the sea power of Gondor. Ciriaher, son of Ciriandil, bided his time, and at last, when he had gathered strength, he came down from the north by sea and by land, and, crossing the river Harnan, his armies utterly defeated the men of the Harad, and their kings were compelled to acknowledge the overlordship of Gondor in 1050. Ciriaher then took the name of Hyarmendakil, South Victor. The might of Hyarmendakil no enemy dared to contest during the remainder of his long reign. He was king for 134 years, the longest reign but one of all the line of Anárion. In his day, Gondor reached the summit of its power. The realm then extended north to the field of Celebrant and the southern eaves of Mirkwood, west to the Grey Flood, east to the inland sea of Rhûn, south to the river Harnan, and thence along the coast to the peninsula and haven of Umbar. The men of the Vales of Anduin acknowledged its authority, and the kings of the Harad did homage to Gondor, and their sons lived as hostages in the court of its king. Mordor was desolate, but was watched over by great fortresses that guarded the passes. So ended the line of the ship kings. Atanatar al-Karin, son of Hyarmendakil, lived in great splendor, so that men said precious stones are pebbles in Gondor for children to play with. But Atanatar loved ease and did nothing to maintain the power that he had inherited, and his two sons were of like temper. The waning of Gondor had already begun before he died, and was doubtless observed by its enemies. The watch upon Mordor was neglected. Nonetheless, it was not until the days of Valacar that the first great evil came upon Gondor, the civil war of the Kinstrife, in which great loss and ruin was caused and never fully repaired. I know that was a long reading, but we had to get started somewhere.
It's a lot of history in there. Yeah,
it is.
We didn't even read the first paragraph, but here
No,
we start out with the fact that there are 31 kings of Gondor after Anárion, and while we're not going to name all of them, we should point out that Anárion is considered the second king because Elendil was High King of Gondor and Arnor.
That's right, and his sons, Anárion and Isildur, were co-rulers of Gondor right up until Anárion's death in Second Age 3440 during the siege of Barad-dûr.
The next year, this is Second Age 3441, saw the death of Elendil and thus the ascension of Isildur to the throne of both Gondor and Arnor. But we go now to the Third Age, Year 2, when Isildur died after leaving the rule of Gondor to Meneldil, the son of Anárion. The realms were split, making Meneldil the first sole ruler of Gondor and the third king of Gondor after Elendil and Isildur.
That's right. Then the text tells us that for more than 1,000 years, Gondor became richer and stronger, even though there was never peace on all their borders at the same time during that time.
But by the time Atanatar II, Alcuin the Glorious, became king, Gondor was in the beginning of its decline.
That's right. Now, he was the 16th king, and we're not going to go through all of them. He became king after his father Hyarmendakil I in Third Age 1149. This was about 150 years before the Witch King settled in Angmar and began to trouble Arnor. I'm just trying to tie it into our last episode and kind of help you bring the two timelines together. Now, we will talk about Atanatar II later. Let's instead look at the reasons for that decay that had become obvious by 1149.
As they'd done in Númenor, the high men married fairly late, and they also weren't having a lot of kids. So that's one thing that when you're going to live 300 to 400 years, but it is a problem with the shorter lifespans that they now have.
Correct. And sure enough, kings started dying without heirs, though not until Tiranon Falastur, the 12th king, who died childless in Third Age 913. For good reason, more on that in the mailbag. But then also the son of the aforementioned Atanatar II, that would be Narmakil I, he died without an heir.
So each time the kingship passes basically to another line. In the case of Falastur, it went to his nephew Eärnil I, and in the case of Narmakil I, it went to his younger brother Calmakil.
Right. And now we pick up where I started reading. The history as provided in the appendices starts properly with Ostaher the 7th king, who began his reign in Third Age 411. Now, he rebuilt Minas Anor, what we now know of as Minas Tirith, in Third Age 420. That's according to the Tale of Years. But why did he have to rebuild it? Well, in Second Age 3429, the year before the Last Alliance, Sauron attacked Gondor, took Minas Ithil, and then besieged Anárion in Minas Anor and in Osgiliath. So that's why I had to rebuild it.
Ah, there we go. Now, interestingly, he decided to summer in Minas Anor and began a new tradition. So we are also told that during his reign, Gondor was first attacked by wild men out of the east. These would, of course, be the Easterlings, and the Tale of Years says that this first invasion took place in the Third Age year 490.
Right.
By this time, Ostohare is 268 years old and has been king for 79 years. So it is his son, Torostar, who defeats the Easterlings and becomes king in Third Age 492. He then takes the name Romendakil, meaning East Victor.
Right. Now, we should probably do a little brief word nerdery on these names. Ostohare is Quenya, and it seems to be made of the elements Osto, meaning city, like we see in the Cinder incognate Ost, like Fornost, Belagost, Osgiliath. The other element is likely Heru, which means Lord. If you remember, Ara Dunakor's Quenya name was Herunumen, Lord of the West. So that's Lord. So it's City Lord or something along those lines.
Nice. Torostar is Quenya. This likely means king of the land. Remember, as we said previously, star as in Forostar, Adustar, and so forth on in Númenor.
Right, all the regions of Númenor, yeah.
And then the tar prefix, which is seen with all of the kings and queens of Númenor.
That's right. I mean, there it's a literal prefix, right? We see, Tar Palantir or whatever, and it's got the hyphen. But here it's just incorporated in the word, so king of the lands. But his name after he ascended to the throne, which is Romendakil, that's also Quenya. Romen means east. It literally means uprising, and it's talking about sunrise. But we talked about that before in terms of directions. And then that Indakil, or just Dakil, means victor.
Well, East Victor or not, he was killed in battle with the Easterlings and succeeded by his son Turambar, who not only won, but won really big, actually taking parts of Rhûn. So now we move to the reign of Taranon Falastor, the first of the ship kings. We skipped over Atanatar the first and Siriondil, both of whose reigns were fairly uneventful. Taranon, on the other hand, oversaw the growth of Gondor's navy and its influence on the coastlines near the Anduin's mouth.
Right. Now, his name, Falastur, means Lord of the Coasts. It comes from Quenya Falase, which you undoubtedly remember more by its Cinder incognate, Falas, like the Anfalas, which means long beach, Falathrim, the elves of the shore, and the other element, of course, Tur, meaning Lord, like Turambar, Master of Doom. Taranon appears to actually be a very interesting word, a mixed language compound. We get Tar again, the high prefix that we've seen in all the other Númenorian kings' names. But then we get Annon, which means gate in Sindarin, like think Morannon, the Black Gate, or the Siranon, the Gate Stream. So it's an interesting mix of Quenya and Sindarin. And then again, coming back to synchronize the timelines like I'm going to try to do here and there, it was during Falastur's reign in 861 that King Eärendil of Arnor died, and that kingdom was split into Arthedain, Rudar, and Cardolan. So kind of now you know where we're at.
Also remember earlier when we mentioned that the kings started dying without heirs. Well, Falastor was so busy building a navy, he didn't see to producing an heir, and so the kinship actually passed to his nephew, Eärendil I.
Now, before we're too hard on Taranon for not producing an heir, we do need to consider to whom he was married, and we'll talk about that in the mailbag.
So his heir, this is his nephew, Eärendil I, was the son of Taranon's younger brother, Tarkirion.
Now, a little quick word nerdery. Eärendil is just a shortened form of Eärendil. That actually comes to us straight from Parma Eldalamberon 17. Tarkirion's name appears to be a compound, again, of Tar, high, and Kiria, ship.
He continued in this tradition of ship kings, getting Pelagir back up to speed and growing the navy even more. And in the Third Age, year 933, 20 years into his reign, he succeeded in taking Umbar after besieging it.
The footnote to this points out that Umbar had long been Númenorian land, but that it had been, quote, a stronghold of the king's men. And we learn, of course, that they would later be called the Black Númenorians, corrupted by Sauron, and who hated above all the followers of Elendil.
And because of this hatred of Elendil, you can probably imagine how much they hated Gondor. The footnote says that because of this hatred, Umbar was only taken at great cost.
Now, here's the thing. All this stuff about Umbar really is important, not just for this part of Gondorian history, but for the upcoming Civil War and for the future. The Corsairs of Umbar are not just a random group of pirates.
Certainly not. And after Eärnil I died in a storm, his son continued this theme. Ciriondil, which is ship lover from Curia, ship, and the Indil, the lover friend element, he grew the navy more.
That's right.
But some of the Black Númenorians, forced out of Umbar, made it to Harad and convinced them to attack Umbar, where Ciriondil was killed in battle after a 79-year reign.
That's right. That is when we get to the last of the Ship Kings and the king who led Gondor to the peak of their power, Ciriahir. Now, his name, or at least this name of his, because he does have another one, means ship lord, from Kyria, ship, which we've seen on the last couple of kings' names, and Heru, lord, which we saw earlier.
Love that this just keeps coming back to all of it. He began his rule in the Third Age, year 1015, when Ciriondil died fighting in the Haradwaith.
By the way, that's around the same time that the Istari arrived in Middle-earth, which is said to be around Third Age 1000.
Ooh, okay, good timing, because it was at this point we actually read Umbar was invested. So does this kind of mean that they're doing well in the stock market, Alan?
Good question, Don, but no. Invested is an archaic word for surrounded, besieged, blockaded. And that's precisely what was happening here as the Haradrim and the former lords of Umbar were besieging Umbar. They were able to resupply and fortify from the sea.
Yeah, being the ship lords, the lord of ships, it's really not surprising that he continued to build up that powerful navy, but he also built enough of an army that when he came down to Umbar to break the siege, the text says he utterly defeated the men of Harad. And this was around Third Age, year 1050.
Correct. Now, this was an eventful time in Middle-earth, right? Around the same time, the Tale of Years tells us that a shadow falls on Greenwood, and men begin to call it Mirkwood. And also, that's the same time that the Periannath, those are the hobbits, are first mentioned in records with the coming of the Harfoots to Eriador.
But back to Ciriahir, this victory over Harad inspired him to take a new name, Hyar Mendikil, which is South Victor. Now, we've talked about the Hyarmen, meaning south, before, back when we looked at the regions of Númenor specifically, Hyar Nustar, the southwest, and Hyarostar, the southeast.
Now, Hyarmen is south. It actually means left hand, and that's because the elves look to the west as their primary direction. So if you're looking to the west, south is on your left hand. And just to kind of give you some orientation, the other directions are Numen, west, as in Númenor, Romen, east, and we've talked about Romendikil's name, and Formen, north, as in Formenos, and things like that.
The Indakil element means victor. We see that in names like Romendikil and Umbardakil.
Right. Now, Hyarmendikil reigned for almost another 100 years after his victory over the Haradrim, for a total of 134 years. That was the longest reign other than that of Meneldil, son of Anarion, and the first sole ruler of Gondor. Gondor at this time was at the zenith of its power, with the kingdom reaching all the way north to the Celebrant. That's where the Limelight reaches the Anduin, and it's as far north as the north edge of Fangorn Forest. The realm also extended west to the Greyflood. Now, that's the river that once defined the southern portion of Arnor and Cardolan, meaning Enedwaith is part of Gondor at this time. And then all the way east to the Sea of Rhûn, which is to the northeast of Mordor and well east of Mirkwood. And then to the south, it extends all the way to the River Harnan and to Umbar itself. So huge kingdom at this point.
A lot of stuff going on there. And even though the kingdom doesn't extend to the Vales of the Anduin, the men who live there basically recognize the authority of Gondor.
Yeah.
However, while the Haradrim had to have their sons basically live in the king's court as a kind of hostage, Mordor, in the meantime, was still being watched over. Spoilers, not for very long, because the line of ship kings comes to an end with Hyarmendikil's death in Third Age, year 1149, when his son Atanatar rose to the throne.
And he's the one that we read about at the beginning of this section, since the decline of Gondor began under his reign. His name, by the way, is Quenya for father of men, Atan for man, like Atani is the plural and it's cognate with Sindarin Edain, and Atar for father, as in Iluvatar, or its Sindarin cognate, Adar, or if you've been watching Rings of Power, Adar. Now, the name Alcarin is Quenya for the glorious, and we actually get that straight from Parma Eldalamberon number 17.
Ah, great band name.
I still like Witnesses of Manwë, actually.
That's a pretty good one. I dig it.
Yeah, it really works.
Back to the text, though, because at this point, Gondor was so powerful and rich by this time that the text gives us a saying about how precious stones are pebbles in Gondor for children to play with.
Yeah, first world problems, basically, right?
Basically.
Yeah. But as is so often the case, an excess of ease and leisure led to a love of leisure for its own sake, and a laziness in leadership is what characterized Alcuin's 77-year reign.
Ugh, laziness for 77 years. I don't like it.
Yeah.
But about the only thing of significance that he did was create a new crown. Yay.
Mm-hmm.
In a footnote that we looked at last episode related to heirlooms, remember the Ring of Barahir, Shards of Narsil, Star of Elendil, Scepter of Annúminas, they were all kept safely in Rivendell. So we also see something about the Crown of Gondor. The Crown of Gondor was derived from the form of a Númenorian war helm. In the beginning, it was indeed a plain helm, and it is said to have been the one that Isildur wore in the Battle of Dagorlad, for the helm of Anárion was crushed by the stone cast from Barad-dûr that slew him. But in the days of Atanatar Alcuin, this was replaced by the jeweled helm that was used in the crowning of Aragorn.
We also have some words from Tolkien himself on this crown, found in letter 211 to Rona Bear. There he writes, "The Númenorians of Gondor were proud, peculiar, and archaic, and, I think, are best pictured in, say, Egyptian terms. In many ways, they resembled Egyptians, the love of and power to construct, the gigantic and massive, and in their great interest in ancestry and in tombs. I think the crown of Gondor, the South Kingdom, was very tall, like that of Egypt, but with wings attached, not set straight back, but at an angle. The North Kingdom had only a diadem." Now, that diadem is, of course, the Elendil that we talked about before.
Yeah, it's a pretty big deal. The text here in the appendices explains that his two sons had a similar mindset of this kind of entitlement.
Right. Narmakil, probably Fire Sword, though not aptly named as he did just about nothing, and Calmakil, probably Sword of Light, yet another overly optimistic name.
Yeah, Gondor was already on the decline during Alcuin's reign. They were no longer diligent in their watch for Mordor.
But the text reminds us that the first great evil didn't hit Gondor until the days of Valacar, and that's 4 kings after Alcuin. And we'll read about that when we come back from the break. Now, we'll get back to some guy building some statues, but before we do, we want to remind you there's a lot more talk going on at the Prancing Pony podcast than just us.
That's right. The PPP has an amazing listener community. They are always coming up with great questions and discussions across our social media spaces. Check out our common room on Facebook, the dedicated subreddit, Twitter, and much more.
Now, on Facebook, just look for the Prancing Pony podcast. Follow the page to get the news, but you're going to want to join the group to get involved in some great discussions.
Or if you'd prefer Reddit, you can find us there at r/PrancingPonyPod. On Twitter and Instagram, we are simply at PrancingPonyPod.
Hey, and if you want daily Tolkien content, and who doesn't, right? Check out Today's Tolkien Times on YouTube and on your favorite podcast apps. It's my new short format daily show with everything from Mailbag Monday to Silmarillion Saturday. Be sure to check it out at youtube.com/@TolkienTimes and follow @TolkienTimes on all your social media. Now, Dawn, I'm going to have you pick up where I left off.
Manalcar, son of Calmakil, was a man of great vigor, and in 1240, Narmakil, to rid himself of all cares, made him regent of the realm. From that time onward, he governed Gondor in the name of the kings, until he succeeded his father. His chief concern was with the Northmen. These had increased greatly in the peace brought by the power of Gondor. The kings showed them favor, since they were the nearest in kin of lesser men to the Dunedain, being, for the most part, descendants of those from whom the Edain of old had come. And they gave them wide lands beyond Anduin, south of Greenwood the Great, to be a defense against men of the east. For in the past, the attacks of the Easterlings had come mostly over the plain, between the inland sea and the Ash Mountains. In the days of Narmakil I, their attacks began again, though at first with little force. But it was learned by the regent that the Northmen did not always remain true to Gondor, and some would join forces with the Easterlings, either out of greed for spoil or in furtherance of feuds among their princes. Minalcar, therefore, in 1248, led out a great force, and between Rovanion and the inland sea, he defeated a large army of the Easterlings and destroyed all their camps and settlements east of the sea. He then took the name of Romendakil. On his return, Romendakil fortified the west shore of Anduin as far as the inflow of the Limelight, and forbade any stranger to pass down the river beyond the Emyn Muil. He it was that built the pillars of the Argonath at the entrance of Nen Hithoil. But since he needed men, and desired to strengthen the bond between Gondor and the Northmen, he took many of them into his service, and gave to some high rank in his armies. Romendikil showed special favor to Vidugavia, who had aided him in the war. He called himself King of Rovanion, and was indeed the most powerful of the northern princes, though his own realm lay between Greenwood and the river Kelduin. In 1250, Romendikil sent his son Eldacar as an ambassador to dwell for a while with Vidugavia, and make himself acquainted with the language, manner, and policies of the Northmen. But Eldacar far exceeded his father's designs. He grew to love the northern lands and people, and he married Vidumavi, the daughter of Vidugavia. It was some years before he returned. From this marriage came later the War of the Kinstrife.
Oh boy. Yeah. This so much comes from this.
Yeah.
But let's go back to the beginning of this reading, right? After the lazy reign of his father, Narmakil inherited the throne. At least his laziness meant he didn't even want the job. So 14 years into his reign, in 1240, he appointed his nephew Minalcar to be the regent of Gondor, essentially ruling in his stead.
Although this short paragraph about Minalcar's appointment as regent wasn't added until the second edition in 1965.
That's right. Now, Narmakil was the second king without an heir. We'd already mentioned Turanon earlier. So when Narmakil died, the throne went to his younger brother Kamakil in 1294. Now, by this point, Minalkir, a name which probably means first glory, was already regent, and Kamakil did nothing to change this, keeping him in the position of regent until his own death in 1304.
So Minalcar ruled as regent for more than 60 years, and during that time, the text explains his primary efforts were in dealings with the Northmen. So before we take a look at the history between Gondor and the Northmen, let's look briefly at who these Northmen were.
That's right. Now we know that when the Edain went west, there were three houses: the House of Beor, the House of Hador, and the House of Hala.
Now, in Of Dwarves and Men, which is an essay found in the Peoples of Middle-earth, we learn that the folk of Beor were the first men to enter Beleriand, and that they were a small people.
Now, after that, we read about three different hosts of the folk of Hador, a much more numerous group, coming up from the south. We also read that the dwarves worked closely with the people of the House of Hador, and that's where we get a clue. These men, it seems, had come westward until faced by the great greenwood, and then had divided, some reaching the Anduin and passing thence northward up the vales, some passing between the north eaves of the wood and the Ered Mithrin. Only a small part of this people, already very numerous and divided into many tribes, had then passed on into Eriador, and so come at last to Beleriand. They were brave and loyal folk, true-hearted, haters of Morgoth and his servants.
Love that.
Yep.
Combined with what we read here, that the Northmen were, for the most part, descendants of those people from whom the Edain of old had come, it would kind of seem that these Northmen, although middlemen, having never come into Beleriand to fight against Morgoth and go to Númenor, they are indeed kin and loyal folk. Remember, haters of Morgoth.
And I think that's important because we're going to see the reaction of some in Gondor to later events, and we need to talk through that.
Yeah, it's going to have a definite effect. So why was Minalcar's chief concern with these Northmen? Well, they'd grown a lot thanks to the peace in the region that had come as a result of this Gondorian strength.
That's right. Now, they'd been given lands to the east of the Anduin and south of the Greenwood. That's in part, Gondor's not stupid here. They're not just giving them lands out of pure generosity. They gave them these lands as a defense, as a buffer zone against the attacks of the Easterlings who had typically been coming into Gondor through that area north of Mordor, south of Greenwood, coming through, south of the Sea of Rune. They just come straight through those plains.
Yeah, and we're then told about those attacks, in fact, as they began during Narmakil's reign.
Yeah, begin again, actually. But despite their lineage, some of the Northmen allegedly joined forces with the Easterlings and betrayed Gondor. By the way, in the first edition, because Minalcar wasn't the regent, that first edition says that it was learned by the king that the Northmen had not been faithful. That got changed to regent in the second edition.
Now, Minalcar did the regent's job, and in 1248 led a big army and defeated the Easterlings and destroyed their camp, which were all the way on the east side of the Sea of Rune.
Man, that's a long way.
Further. Yeah, it's a long way. This is another new bit that was added in the second edition here. This is when he took the name Romendikil, remember, East Victor, as we said previously.
Right. Now, when he came back, which must have taken a while, have you seen how far away the Sea of Rune is?
It's a ways.
Yeah. So that's when he strengthened the western shore of the Anduin, and that's the Gondor side of the shore, all the way up to the Limelight.
Now, he also built the Argonath, the Pillars of the Kings, at the north end of Lake Nen Hithoil. Now, we don't get to do this much during these episodes on ancient Gondorian history, so let's take advantage of it while we can and return you to Chapter 9 of Book 2, The Great River, for a look at these very mighty statues. We begin. As Frodo was borne towards them, the great pillars rose like towers to meet him. Giants, they seemed to him, vast gray figures, silent but threatening. Then he saw that they were indeed shaped and fashioned. The craft and power of old had wrought upon them, and still they preserved, through the sun and rains of forgotten years, the mighty likenesses in which they had been hewn.
Upon great pedestals founded in the deep waters stood two great kings of stone. Still with blurred eyes and crannied brows they frowned upon the north. The left hand of each was raised palm outwards in gesture of warning. In each right hand there was an axe. Upon each head there was a crumbling helm and crown. And now it's word nerd time. Tolkien tells us that Argonath means royal stones, as it contains, quote, the element gond equals stone in Elvish. Now compare that, Tolkien says, to Quenya ondo stone as a material or a large mass of stone or great rock. Ondonore, Sindarin for Gondor, literally land of stone, referring to the great works and buildings of stone for which the Númenorians were renowned. In Sindarin, the shorter gon was used for smaller objects made of stone, especially carved figures.
He goes on to briefly discuss other elements. In Sindarin, Oth was the sign of collective or group plurals, here used because the Argonath were a pair of twin statues. Ar-a was a prefix expressing royalty. We see this in Aragorn or the Númenorian kings like Ar-Pharazôn.
Right. Now, we don't know precisely when the Argonath was built. It could be shortly after 1248, after his victory, or at some other time while he was regent and governed Gondor until he succeeded his father Calmakill in 1304. Or it could have even happened during his reign as king, which lasted until 1366, but sometime between 1248 and 1366. In any case, by the time Frodo sees them in 3019, they're close to 1700 years old. So that would be like coming across stone statues now that were built around the year 300 AD.
Now, this is kind of interesting. We don't know why they are depicted holding axes instead of swords, but I believe you and Sean talked about this. This was all the way back in, I believe, season 4, episode 175. You were looking at the Hamilton Skull's reader companion, and you learned that the sword seemed to have been the usual Númenorian weapon, but axe is a deliberate change from sword, which appeared in the draft.
That's right. And I talked about this really interesting but totally unsupported headcanon on this, and there is nothing in the text to give us a suggestion as to why he chose axes. But I think about how Romendikill desired to strengthen the bond between Gondor and the Northmen, right? He took them into his service, made them officers in his armies, sent his son up to them, right? What if, like the Northmen of the primary world, Tolkien's Northmen often fought with axes instead of swords? And this was just a way of sort of honoring or acknowledging that. I don't know. Totally random guess.
I like it.
After all, it does seem a little bit unusual to put axes in the hands of the sons of Elendil, so there has to be some reason why Romendikill chose to portray them this way.
You could also potentially say there's an alternate version. It's a callback to Tuor, who fought with the axe drum boarleg.
Yeah, there you go.
Maybe. Who even knows? All right, so Argonath sidebar is over. We come back and we learn about what you touched on in that headcanon, the fact that Romendikill wanted to build the friendship and alliance with the Northmen, especially a man by the name of Vidugavia, the most powerful of the northern leaders, who called himself the King of Rovanion. Now, his realm is said to have been to the east of Greenwood, between it and the river running.
Now, let's talk about his name, though, because we're going to start to see some interesting names among the Northmen. They're in a language that we don't see often in The Lord of the Rings, Gothic, and it's translated as Woodlord. And we'll soon learn that his daughter's name was Vidumavi, which is Gothic for Wood Maiden. But interestingly, and this is where the language thing comes into play, one of Vidugavia's descendants several hundred years later was Marhuini, which is Gothic for horse soldier, and he's the one who led his people north to the Vales of Anduin, the people that would become the Eotheod and eventually the Rohirrim.
So the Rohirrim are descended from the Northmen and the House of Hodor. I guess that kind of explains the golden hair thing.
It does, but it also explains the language that Tolkien used to represent them here in the text, Gothic. And let me explain. Actually, no, let me have Christopher Tolkien explain. He mentions this specifically in Unfinished Tales, writing in a footnote in the Tale of Cirion and Eorl that the names of the early kings and princes of the Northmen and the Eotheod are Gothic in form, not Old English, Anglo-Saxon, as in the case of Leod, Eorl, and the later Rohirrim. He then explains that Vidugavia is a Latinized spelling of the recorded Gothic name that means wood dweller, and the same is true of Vidumavi. And coming back to this point about the language connection, Christopher writes, since, as is explained in Appendix F2, the language of Rohan was made to resemble ancient English, the names of the ancestors of the Rohirrim are cast into the forms of the earliest recorded Germanic language.
What didn't Tolkien think about, honestly? So in an effort to bring the Northmen closer to Gondor as allies, Rumendikil sends his son Valacar, a name that appears to mean Helm of the Valar.
Yeah,
great
cool name. Yeah,
very cool. He is going to be an ambassador to the Northmen, going to learn the language, the culture, and the policies of all of these people.
That's right. Now, in the original edition of this appendix, we read, in return for taking Northmen into his service and giving them rank, he sent his son Valacar to dwell for a while with Vidugavia, who called himself the king of Rhovanion, and was indeed the most powerful of their princes, though his own realm lay between Greenwood and the River Running. There, Valacar was wedded to Vidugavia's daughter, and so caused later the evil war of the kin strife. Now, just without enough context, that almost lays the blame at Valacar's feet.
A little bit, and I'm kind of glad that Tolkien updated this, because as it read originally, it just kind of looked like a political move.
Yeah.
Valacar is being sent to marry a noble woman to the north to sort of cement the alliance, almost as though Rumendikil caused the kin strife.
Right.
But with the additions here, we kind of see that this was very far from just a political move.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, it was a political move to send him there, but Tolkien has the fictional writer of the appendix write that bit about Valacar far exceeding his father's designs. He fell in love with the North, with these people, going so far as to marry Vidugavia's daughter Vidumavi before coming back to Gondor years later.
And speaking of later, that is what we are covering in the next little bit. Alan, you want to get us started?
I will indeed. For the high men of Gondor already looked askance at the Northmen among them, and it was a thing unheard of before that the heir of the crown, or any son of the king, should wed one of lesser and alien race. There was already rebellion in the southern provinces when King Valacar grew old. His queen had been a fair and noble lady, but short-lived according to the fate of lesser men, and the Dunedain feared that her descendants would prove the same and fall from the majesty of the kings of men. Also, they were unwilling to accept as lord her son, who, though he was now called Eldacar, had been born in an alien country and was named in his youth Vinitharia, a name of his mother's people. Therefore, when Eldacar succeeded his father, there was war in Gondor. But Eldacar did not prove easy to thrust from his heritage. To the lineage of Gondor he added the fearless spirit of the Northmen. He was handsome and valiant, and showed no sign of aging more swiftly than his father. When the Confederates, led by descendants of the kings, rose against him, he opposed them to the end of his strength. At last he was besieged in Osgiliath, and held it long, until hunger and the greater forces of the rebels drove him out, leaving the city in flames. In that siege and burning, the tower of the dome of Osgiliath was destroyed, and the Palantir was lost in the waters. But Eldacar eluded his enemies and came to the north, to his kinsfolk in Rhovanion. Many gathered to him there, both of the Northmen in the service of Gondor, and of the Dunedain of the northern parts of the realm. For many of the latter had learned to esteem him, and many more came to hate his usurper. This was Castamir, grandson of Calamectar, younger brother of Rumendikil II. He was not only one of those nearest by blood to the crown, but he had the greatest following of all the rebels, for he was the captain of ships, and was supported by the people of the coasts and of the great havens of Pelargir and Umbar. Castamir had not long sat upon the throne before he proved himself haughty and ungenerous. He was a cruel man, as he had first shown in the taking of Osgiliath. He caused Ornendil, son of Eldacar, who was captured, to be put to death, and the slaughter and destruction done in the city at his bidding far exceeded the needs of war. This was remembered in Minas Anor and in Ithilien, and there love for Castamir was further lessened when it became seen that he cared little for the land, and thought only of the fleets, and purposed to remove the king's seat to Pelargir. Thus he had been king only 10 years, when Eldacar, seeing his time, came with a great army out of the north, and folk flocked to him from Calanarthon and Anárion and Ithilien. There was a great battle in Lebennin at the crossings of Erwi, in which much of the best blood in Gondor was shed. Eldacar himself slew Castamir in combat, and so was avenged for Ornendil. But Castamir's sons escaped, and with others of their kin, and many people of the fleets, they held out long at Pelargir. When they had gathered there all the force that they could, for Eldacar had no ships to beset them by sea, they sailed away and established themselves at Umbar. There they made a refuge for all the enemies of the king, and a lordship independent of his crown. Umbar remained at war with Gondor for many lives of men, a threat to its coastlands and to all traffic on the sea. It was never again completely subdued until the days of Elessar, and the region of South Gondor became a debatable land between the Corsairs and the kings.
Oh, those sweet, sweet details on that battle. I love it.
Man, I know.
Such
Can
a
you
good
imagine this, though, fleshed out as like a full couple of chapters, like we see with the Battle of the Pelennor Fields? Just
Hey, Peter Jackson,
glorious.
If you're listening to this, let's get this going.
Well, he already played a Corsair of Umbar, so he definitely could be in the sequel. Yeah.
Castamir. Cast him as Castamir.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know about
Might be a bit much, yeah.
Yeah, maybe.
So we're finally getting details of that war of the Kinstrife mentioned at the end of the previous reading, and it all starts with the perception that the Northmen are less than these high men of Númenor.
Now, can we talk about how troubling this is, and not just from some sort of modern perspective? I mean, these are men descended from the House of Hador. These people have a history of opposing Morgoth, but the smug men of Gondor look askance at the Northmen.
A great way to describe it, and there's a bit more detail in the drafts found in Peoples of Middle-earth, the making of Appendix A. There we read, "The high men of Gondor had long looked askance at the Northmen among them, who had borne themselves more proudly since the coming of Vidumavi."
Aha. So in other words, once Valacar came back to Gondor with his wife and kids, the Northmen who were there in Gondor, I mean, remember, Remendikil had taken many of them into his service, given them rank in the army. So these Northmen are carrying themselves with a bit of pride. I mean, they know the significance of Vidumavi's arrival, of her marrying the son of the king, and the next heir being her son.
Yeah, but some people in Gondor could not stand this, arguing that she was of lesser and alien race. Not a good look, Gondorians.
No.
And nobody who is heir to the crown should be married to someone like this, to the point where there's already rebellion towards the end of the reign of Valacar.
Now, here's the thing. By all accounts, Vidumavi was great. The text here says she was noble but shorter lived, but an earlier typescript actually gave us a lot more. She bore herself wisely and endeared herself to all those who knew her. She learned well the speech and manners of Gondor and was willing to be called by the name Galadwin, a rendering of her northern name into the Sindarin tongue. And that absolutely is a Sindarin translation of wood maiden, from Galath meaning tree, like the Galadrim or Caras Galadhon, and Wen, which is just the suffix form of Gwend, meaning maiden. We see that in Arwen or Morwen or Earwen, and Wen is actually the same in both Quenya and Sindarin.
Love that.
Yeah.
Finally, we also read that she was a fair and noble lady of high courage, which she imparted to her children. But though she lived to a great age, as such was reckoned among her people, she died in 1344. Though in one copy of her death, it was said to be in 1332.
Okay. Well, we do know that her son Eldacar was born in 1255. So she died either 77 or 89 years after the birth of her son. So assuming she was very young, let's say 20 when she gave birth, she was at least 100, if not closer to 120 years of age.
That's pretty good. Now, of course, that is young for a high man of Gondor. So
true.
there was concern about her descendants, not only Eldacar, but any of his sons would be relatively short-lived, and that they would fall from the majesty of the kings of men, which is, because Remendikil is still alive and very much still the king when she died. He would pass 22 years later.
Right.
But that same draft says that after her death, the heart of Remendikil grew heavy, foreboding the troubles that would come.
Now, all right, we've bounced back and forth in time as we've talked about Remendikil, Valacar, Vidumavi, and even Eldacar. But let's try to clear that all up, give you a little bit more of a visual timeline. It was in 1250 that Valacar was sent to live with Vidugavia. Somewhere in the next 5 years before 1255, Eldacar married Vidumavi. Now, in 1255, while he was still in the north, Eldacar and Vidumavi had their son Eldacar. So there's that 5-year gap between the time he arrives and the time that Eldacar is born. 5 years later, in 1260, Eldacar is recalled to Gondor. That date is found in the typescript. That same typescript says that he returned to Gondor with his wife and children, and with them came a household of noblemen and women of the north.
Vidumavi then dies in 1344, which is 84 years after Eldacar returned to Gondor.
That's a long time that she's in
Long
Gondor.
Long time. Romendikil dies in 1366, and Eldacar takes the throne. Now, to help synchronize these timelines, this is around the time that, up in Arthedain, King Arvaleg, who began his rule in Third Age 1356, allied with Cardolan and the elves of Lindon and drove Angmar back. So we're all the way back to our last episode. Eldacar then dies in 1432. He was 238, and his son Eldacar becomes king at age 187.
Now, you'd think that a king ascending to the throne at the age of 187 would suggest that Eldacar has not been affected by the lesser and alien race of the Northmen.
Yeah.
In fact, he doesn't die until 1490 at the age of 235, just 3 years shorter a life than his own father.
Kind of feels like they're just looking for an excuse,
but
I guess enough people refuse to accept him as their king thanks to his heritage. Mm-hmm. He had been given the name in the northern tongue where he was born, as one would expect, and that name was Vinitharia.
Now, interestingly, in the typescript, we read that his Northman name bore much the same meaning as Romendikil. Well, yeah, as it turns out. It's been suggested that the name is a modified form of a Gothic name meaning one who battles the Vends. The Vends were a Slavic people who lived in Germanic territories, and the name has also been translated as Slav Slayer. Now, Tolkien translated it to refer to Easterlings, just as the Slavic people were from the east to the Goths. Thus, one who battles the Easterlings, Easterling Slayer, just like East Victor.
I feel like this man has thought of everything. My goodness.
So
you've got the Northman name, the Northman mother, and in the eyes of many Gondorians, this disqualifies him from the throne. And we see this pretty blatantly in that typescript where we read that near the end of Eldacar's reign, there was already open rebellion in the southern provinces. There were gathered many of those who declared that they would never accept as king a man half of foreign race born in an alien country. Vinitharia is his right name, they said. Let him go back to the land where it belongs.
Oh, that is ugly. That is ugly. Go back where you came from, right? This just disturbingly high level of racism and bigotry. It's deeply unfitting for the men of Númenor, right? These are the descendants of the faithful who escaped the downfall of Númenor. Anyway, all that for what, a paragraph? So let's go ahead and get into the Civil War now.
Let's get into it. Eldacar took the throne in 1432, and we read that when he does that, there was war in Gondor, led by those who refused to accept him as king simply because of his ancestry via his mother. After all, there was no argument that he was the son of the rightful king.
Right.
Those opposing him didn't have an easy job. He was not only a strong Gondorian, but he added the fearless spirit of the Northmen, fighting against his opposition to the very end.
I love that. And finally, we read of the end of his first reign, or the first half of his reign, as he's under siege in the capital of Osgiliath. And during that siege, that's when we learned that the tower of the dome of Osgiliath was destroyed and the Palantir was lost in the Anduin. But that Palantir was no joke. As we read in Unfinished Tales about the Palantiri in general, at smallest, they were about a foot in diameter. Okay, so now we're thinking of the one that we see in the films, the bowling ball-sized one, right? But the text continues. Some, certainly the stones of Osgiliath at Amansul, were much larger and could not be lifted by one man.
Pretty big, okay, because in the chapter, the Palantir, Gandalf explained to Pippin that the chief and master of these stones was under the Dome of Stars at Osgiliath before its ruin.
Now, I have to say, this Tower of the Dome bit is an interesting little thing to sort of digress on. It did read the Tower of the Stone of Osgiliath until 1973. But Christopher submitted the correction to Allen and Unwin based on what his father had done in the proofing copies, where twice he crossed out stone and wrote dome in the margin.
It's just an attention to detail level that we really don't see anymore. No. But whatever the case, in 1437, after 5 years of civil war, the tower or that dome were destroyed and the Master Stone lost to the river as Eldacar escapes the siege and made it to the northern Rivanion as a king in exile. And while he is there, he brought together not just the Northmen who had been in service to Gondor, but also many men of Gondor of the northern parts of the realm.
Now, to be clear, by the way, that's the northern parts of the realm of Gondor. It's not like he's pulling the Dunedain from former realms of Arnor. He's not going to Arthedain or Cardolan and getting Dunedain from there. There are two reasons why he was able to get men of Gondor on his side. One is just the people had begun to respect him, like they saw him for who he was. But the other is that people hated Castamir the Usurper.
Yeah, not a good guy. So let's go back a few kings to kind of explain how he's related.
Yeah.
So, Alan, do you remember Atanatar Alcarin, the lazy guy that did nothing?
The lazy guy, that's right.
His sons, Narmakil and Kalmakil. Narmakil was king, but he died childless, so the throne went to his brother, Karmakil. But most of the time of their two reigns, Gondor was essentially ruled by Karmakil's son, Minalcar, the guy who became Ramendakil, or Eldacar's grandfather.
That's right. Well, Kalmakil, right, the father of Minalcar, the guy who became Ramendakil. So Kalmakil had two sons, Minalcar, who we've talked about, or Ramendakil, and a guy by the name of Kalimektar. Castamir is the grandson of Kalimektar, so he's the great-grandson of Kalmakil. And that puts him near to the throne by his lineage, and when combined with his following in the south, he became the de facto leader of the rebellion.
We also see that he was captain of ships, sort of like admiral of the fleet. He holds a lot of power. He's got a lot of influence in the naval forces. Not surprisingly, then, most of his influence was over the people who lived on the coasts and near the sort of southern havens of Pelagir and the then recently recaptured Umbar.
That's right. Now, as for his name, it's Quenya, but we can really only be sure about the Mira element, which means jewel. We have no idea what Casta could mean.
Yeah, going back to Eldacar and how he got so many men of Gondor to support him up in the north, well, that's because Castamir turned out to be kind of a terrible king that nobody wanted.
Absolutely. And the text tells us he was haughty and ungenerous, but more than that, he was just flat out cruel. I mean, when he'd captured the exiled King Eldacar's son, Ornendil, by the way, that's a name that means tree lover, he had him killed. That's not very Tolkien of him. It's more J.R.R. Martin, for that matter. It's a very brutal, sort of low fantasy moment there. Ornendil wasn't a child, though, to be clear. It's not like he dragged out a 6-year-old and killed him in front of everybody. Ornendil was 107, probably older than that, actually.
Yeah, even so, though, I think Tolkien's definitely trying to stress the family bonds, because that was not, though, the only unnecessary death.
No.
The slaughter and destruction done in the city at his bidding far exceeded the needs of war. Basically, in other words, he went too far, further than any war could justify.
That's correct. And he ended up being very regional in his leadership, right? He didn't care about the land, right? So people in Ithilien and all these areas didn't really, they felt like they weren't represented. He was only concerned about the navy. So he was alienating all the people up in here in Minas Anor and other areas. And that really came to a head when he started talking about moving the capital to Pelargir, which just ticked off the locals. I mean, hint, if you're going to usurp the throne, you should probably act like you want to stay there instead of doing everything possible to turn the people against you. I mean, after all, they were fickle enough to support your rebellion. So you just got to think about that.
Not doing himself any favors.
No.
So Castamir gets this short 10-year reign. So just for timeline purposes, it is Third Age year 1447. Eldacar and a large army come down from the north, growing that army as he travels south.
That's right. And he gets a bunch of new support from Kalanarthon. That's the region we now know of as Rohan. Anárion, which is also to the north of the White Mountains, but closer to Minas Tirith, which was, of course, then Minas Anor, as well as Ithilien, and that's the region between the Anduin and the Ephel-Duath.
The two forces wind up clashing in Lebanon. This is at the crossing of the Erui. So let's take a look at that. Look at the map of Gondor. You're going to see Erui is the easternmost river that flows from the White Mountains to the Anduin, pouring into the river south of the Emen Arnen and well north of Pelagir.
That's right. Now, depending on the map that you're looking at, you might see a dotted line representing a road that connects Minas Tirith to Pelargir. Where that road crosses the Erui is, not surprisingly, called the Crossings of Erui, and that's where we read, tragically, that in this battle, much of the best blood in Gondor was shed. And that is a sad reality in any civil war where all the casualties are of your own kin.
Yeah, it's kind of heartbreaking when you think about it, what we lost.
Yeah.
We also learned here that Eldacar faced off against Castamir personally killing him in vengeance for the death of his son. But, and this is the most important thing for a lot of reasons going forward, Castamir's sons got away and were able to flee to Pelargir, where they held off the forces of Eldacar.
And that makes sense because Eldacar only had an army, right? He didn't have a navy, so he couldn't stop Castamir's sons and the rest of the rebels from just setting sail from Pelargir and escaping to Umbar. And that is how Umbar became a longtime foe of Gondor, a lordship independent of the king of Gondor.
Just unnecessary bloodshed. This threat of the Corsairs, there's piracy, there's raids. This continues for close to 1,600 years.
Yeah.
Before the text says it was completely subdued by King Elisar's reign, which began, if you've been listening to this podcast, in the year 3019 of the Third Age.
That's right.
And the land between Umbar and Gondor, which is basically South Gondor, became a debatable land.
Right. You see these on maps all the time where two countries lay claim to the same spot of land, and it's just, we still haven't figured out whose this is. So, all right, we'll come right back. Folks, if you enjoy the show, please consider supporting the PPP by joining the Fellowship of the Podcast. It's what gives me the ability to work on making the show better every single season. Now, when you join, you get the best Discord community around. And that includes live episode recordings, hangouts every month. You get episode postscripts. You can get ad-free episodes, free merch, and more.
You can also become part of our Questions After Nightfall episodes, or even join us as a guest in the North Wing. So please go to patreon.com/prancingponypod to show your support and join the Fellowship of the Podcast.
And you can always help us out by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts and a rating on Spotify. And please recommend us to your friends. Dawn, can you go ahead and pick up and tell us about the return of Eldacar?
The Return of the King, kind of ish, maybe? I don't know.
Return of a King.
One of them. The loss of Umbar was grievous to Gondor, not only because the realm was diminished in the south and its hold upon the men of Harad was loosened, but because it was there that Ar-Pharazôn the Golden, the last king of Númenor, had landed and humbled the might of Sauron. Though great evil had come after, even the followers of Elendil remembered with pride the coming of the great host of Ar-Pharazôn out of the deeps of the sea. And on the highest hill of the headland above the haven, they had set a great white pillar as a monument. It was crowned with a globe of crystal that took the rays of the sun and of the moon and shone like a bright star that could be seen in clear weather even on the coasts of Gondor, or far out upon the western sea. So it stood, until after the second arising of Sauron, which now approached. Umbar fell under the domination of his servants, and the memorial of his humiliation was thrown down. After the return of Eldacar, the blood of the kingly house and other houses of the Dunedain became more mingled with that of lesser men, for many of the great had been slain in the kinstrife, while Eldacar showed favor to the Northmen, by whose help he had regained the crown, and the people of Gondor were replenished by great numbers that came from Rhovanion. This mingling did not at first hasten the waning of the Dunedain, as had been feared, but the waning still proceeded, little by little, as it had before. For no doubt it was due above all to Middle-earth itself, and to the slow withdrawing of the gifts of the Númenorians after the downfall of the Land of the Star. Eldacar lived to his 235th year, and was king for 58 years, of which 10 were spent in exile.
Wow. Now, before we get to the return of Eldacar, that is the return of a king, and what that meant for the future of the bloodline of the kings, we get this cool paragraph about what the loss of Umbar meant to Gondor. And it wasn't just because of the strategic value in their conflict with the Haradrim, though that was definitely a thing.
It definitely was, but it was a symbolic loss as well, because that is where Ar-Pharazôn reached the shores of Middle-earth, took Sauron prisoner, and Alan, let's take a look at that moment in the Akallabeth.
Yeah, let's do that.
And sitting upon his carven throne in the city of Ar-Menelaus, in the glory of his power, Ar-Pharazôn brooded darkly, thinking of war, for he had learned in Middle-earth of the strength of the realm of Sauron, and of his hatred of Westerness. And now there came to him the masters of ships and captains returning out of the east, and they reported that Sauron was putting forth his might, since Ar-Pharazôn had gone back from Middle-earth, and he was pressing down upon the cities by the coast, and he had taken now the title of King of Men, and declared his purpose to drive the Númenorians into the sea and destroy even Númenor, if that might be. Great was the anger of Ar-Pharazôn at these tidings, and as he pondered long in secret, his heart was filled with the desire for power unbounded, and the sole dominion of his will, and he determined, without counsel of the Valar, or the aid of any wisdom but his own, that the title of King of Men he would himself claim, and would compel Sauron to become his vassal and his servant, for in his pride he deemed that no king should ever arise so mighty as to vie with the heir of Eärendil. Therefore he began in that time to smithy great hoard of weapons, and many ships of war he built, and stored them with his arms. And when all was made ready, he himself set sail with his host into the east.
Well, what happened then? The text continues. And men saw his sails coming up out of the sunset, dyed as with scarlet, and gleaming with red and gold. And fear fell upon the dwellers by the coasts, and they fled far away. But the fleet came at last to that place that was called Umbar, where was the mighty haven of the Númenorians that no hand had wrought. Empty and silent were all the lands about when the king of the sea marched upon Middle-earth. For 7 days he journeyed with banner and trumpet, and he came to a hill, and he went up, and he set there his pavilion and his throne, and he sat him down in the midst of the land, and the tents of his host were ranged all about him, blue, golden, and white, as a field of tall flowers. Then he sent forth heralds, and he commanded Sauron to come before him, and swear to him fealty. And Sauron came. Even from his mighty tower of Barad-dûr he came, and made no offer of battle. For he perceived that the power and majesty of the kings of the sea surpassed all rumor of them, so that he could not trust even the greatest of his servants to withstand them. And he saw not his time yet to work his will with the Dunedain. And he was crafty, well skilled to gain what he would by subtlety, when force might not avail. Therefore he humbled himself before Ar-Pharazôn, and smoothed his tongue. And men wondered, for all that he said seemed fair and wise. But Ar-Pharazôn was not yet deceived, and it came into his mind that, for the better keeping of Sauron and of his oaths of fealty, he should be brought to Númenor, there to dwell as a hostage for himself and all his servants in Middle-earth. To this Sauron assented as one constrained, yet in his secret thought he received it gladly, for it chimed indeed with his desire.
The deceiver.
He's so tricky.
He's so tricky. Now, despite the evil that came of all of this as a result, even the faithful took pride in the story of Ar-Pharazôn coming to Middle-earth and humbling even Sauron himself.
That's right. So much so that they put a white pillar on a hill as a monument. And it seems rather like a lighthouse, right? It took the light of both sun and moon and shined it far out to the sea. And that pillar remained until the second arising of Sauron, when it was torn down.
And now we get an explanation of what happened in the line of kings after Eldacar's return, and indeed the blood of the line of kings did get mingled with the blood of these so-called lesser people.
That's right. But interestingly, it was in large part precisely because of the usurpation by Castamir in the first place. His actions are the ones that led to the deaths of so many high men and led to Eldacar having to bring even more Northmen into Gondor, partly out of thanks for helping him restore his kingship, and partly just to restore the population that had been sapped through the Civil War. So if the rebels hadn't started the Civil War, the bloodlines would have remained purer for a longer period of time. Irony.
Feels like one of those self-fulfilling prophecies kind of stuff. Yeah, because at first, it didn't result in the shorter lifespan. Alan, we just talked about it, but, eventually their lifespans did begin to decrease.
Right, as they had already been doing, the text says. And it's due less to the mingling of the bloodlines and more to do with the nature of Middle-earth itself, right? This is an imperfect world. This is a fallen world, right? It is Arda marred. It has the spirit of Morgoth sort of in it. So anything that is flawed, we're going to see things that lead to, in this case, the shrinking of the lifespans. But more importantly than that, I think, is what the text adds after that, right? Withdrawing of the gifts of the Númenorians after the destruction of Númenor itself. So, when
just a real shame all around.
Exactly. We take the land from you because you rebelled and tried to come and take immortality from the Valar. So not only do you lose your land, but your lifespans are now going to shrink back to normal.
Yeah, and speaking of shrinking, we get a reign as a king, but not for much, because we're told Eldacar dies at 235 years old after a 58-year reign as king. But of course, it's not a 58-year straight reign. It was a 5-year reign and then a 43-year reign with just a couple of 10 years of exile.
Well, 10 years. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. King in exile. All right.
Alan, I think we've got one more part to read as this civil war comes to an end. What do we got?
We've already had one evil. What about second evil?
Oh.
The second and greatest evil came upon Gondor in the reign of Telemnar, the 26th king, whose father Menardil, son of Eldacar, was slain at Pelargir by the corsairs of Umbar. They were led by Angamaite and Sangahyando, the great-grandsons of Castamir. Soon after, a deadly plague came with dark winds out of the east. The king and all his children died, and great numbers of the people of Gondor, especially those that lived in Osgiliath. Then, for weariness and fewness of men, the watch on the borders of Mordor ceased, and the fortresses that guarded the passes were unmanned. Later it was noted that these things happened even as the shadow grew deep in Greenwood, and many evil things reappeared, signs of the arising of Sauron. It is true that the enemies of Gondor also suffered, or they might have overwhelmed it in its weakness. But Sauron could wait, and it may well be that the opening of Mordor was what he chiefly desired. When King Telemnar died, the white tree of Minas Anor also withered and died. But Torondor, his nephew, who succeeded him, replanted a seedling in the citadel. He it was who removed the king's house permanently to Minas Anor, for Osgiliath was now partly deserted and began to fall into ruin. Few of those who had fled from the plague into Ithilien or to the western dales were willing to return. Torondor, coming young to the throne, had the longest reign of all the kings of Gondor, but he could achieve little more than the reordering of his realm within and the slow nursing of its strength. But Telumectar, his son, remembering the death of Menardil and being troubled by the insolence of the corsairs, who raided his coasts even as far as the Anfalas, gathered his forces and in 1810 took Umbar by storm. In that war, the last descendants of Castamir perished, and Umbar was again held for a while by the kings. Telumectar added to his name the title Umbardakil. But in the new evils that soon befell Gondor, Umbar was again lost and fell into the hands of the men of the Harad.
Oof, it's a rough time to be a Gondorian,
It is, huh? Yeah, no doubt.
The kin strife, we've got that first evil on Gondor. Now we're reading about the second one that Tolkien calls the greatest evil.
Yeah.
The appendix said this happened during the reign of Telemnar. But before we get into that, we should probably look at the intervening kings, Alan.
So Eldacar was followed by his second son, Aldemir, and his first son, Ornendil, being killed by Castamir during the kin strife. We covered that in the last section. Now, Aldemir, his name means tree jewel, was killed during a war with the Harad and the corsairs of Umbar in Third Age 1540. 11 years later, his son Vinyarion, probably meaning new son, defeated the men of Harad in 1551. He took the name Hyarmendakil II, South Victor again. Now, he died 70 years after that in 1621, succeeded by Menardil, which probably means friend of the tower. His reign only lasted 13 years before he was killed in battle at Pelargir by the corsairs of Umbar, led by the great-grandsons of Castamir, Angamaite, and Sangahyando.
And believe it or not, these minor characters actually do get mentioned in one of Tolkien's letters.
Right.
This is way back in 1955. An Oxford student by the name of Richard Jeffrey had written to Tolkien with some etymological questions, and in 1972, he had written again.
Yeah.
This is letter 347, which was Tolkien's reply to 5 difficult linguistic questions, but it is his second question that really intrigues us today, because he pointed out none of the kings of Gondor and Arnor had a name ending in a vowel, as most Quenya names do. Is this to make them less strange in a Sindarin context, whereas the descendants of Castamir, who presumably regarded the later kings as half-breeds, asserted their pure blood with aggressively Quenya names?
That's a very interesting question from this Richard Jeffrey.
Great question.
I mean, he's absolutely right about the fact that all the kings of Gondor have names ending in consonants. And then these two guys, Angamaite and Sangahyando, have names ending in vowels, which is more Quenya. Is this some sort of way of trying to say we're more, pure than you? Tolkien's answer to him was clear, but it also gave us detail on these two guys' names in terms of some word nerdery. He writes, Quenya was known to the learned in Gondor, at least as well as Latin still is in Western Europe. Its use was honorific, and there was no reason to accommodate the Quenya names to Sindarin. And none of the Quenya names in the lists are accommodated. All are in form entirely suitable to Quenya. Quenya permitted, indeed favored, the dentals, N, L, R, S, and T as final consonants. No other final consonants appear in the Quenya lists. So by that, he's already sort of saying, yeah, they are consonantal endings, but that isn't actually rare. That actually is favored in Quenya. So it's more like these other names that he was thinking of were more of an exception. Tolkien goes on to say, Angamaite, iron-handed, and Sangahyando, throng-cleaver, were good Quenya, but no more so than the other names, and there was no need to assert their royal descent as that was clear. They were, however, possibly aggressive in being personal warrior names or nicknames, whereas the other few warlike Quenya names, like Romendikil, were political, assumed by a king in celebration of victories against a public enemy.
Also, kind of conveniently, giving us the translation of the names Angamaite, we get iron-handed, and Sangahyando, throng-cleaver.
That's right. Now, we learn a bit more about this incident in which they killed King Menardil in the drafts found in Peoples of Middle-earth. The rebels of Umbar had never ceased to make war on Gondor since the death of Castamir, attacking its ships and raiding its coast at every opportunity. They had, however, become much mixed in blood through admission of men of Harad, and only their chieftains, descendants of Castamir, were of Númenorian race. An aside, isn't that interesting? Mm-hmm. Griping about pure blood, and then going and allying yourself with Haradrim, and everybody mixes with the Haradrim. Anyway.
Naughty.
Learning through spies that Menardil was at Pelargir, suspecting no peril since the crushing of Harad and Umbar by his father, Angamaite and Sangahyanda, leaders of the Corsairs of Umbar, great-grandsons of Castamir, made a raid up Anduin, slew the king, ravaged Pelargir and the coasts, and escaped with great booty. And I do want to point out, yes, I read Angamaite and Sangahyanda. That's because in the draft it was still Sangahyanda. Later he changed it to Sangahyando.
And if you think all of that was bad, that is not the greatest evil to come upon Gondor. We have a second.
That's all prelude. Yeah.
Yeah, this is just the prequel, man. We have a deadly plague. This took place in 1636. As we talked about last episode, that plague also hit the Shire the next year as it wipes out most of what is left of Cardolan.
That's right. So again, tying those timelines together for you. Here in the south, the plague struck hard, killing King Telemnar, who had come to the throne only 2 years before, at the relatively young age of 118, when Menardil was killed in the raid of Angamaite and Sangahyando. Not only that, but killing all of his children and a vast number of people of Gondor, particularly in the capital of Osgiliath.
We also get a bit more information about the plague in Cirion and Eorl in Unfinished Tales, where we read that the waning of the Northmen of Rhovanion began with the Great Plague, which appeared there in the winter of the year 1635, and soon spread to Gondor. In Gondor, the mortality was great, especially among those who dwelt in cities. It was greater in Rhovanion, for though its people lived mostly in the open and had no great cities, the plague came with a cold winter, when horses and men were driven into shelter, and their low wooden houses and stables were thronged. Moreover, they were little skilled in the arts of healing and medicine, of which much is still known in Gondor, preserved from the wisdom of Númenor. When the plague passed, it is said that more than half of the folk of Rhovanion had perished.
Yeah, just brutal. It's just a terrible thing to have happened, and obviously it came from Sauron, as we've pointed out.
Yeah.
No wonder then, with so many dead, the watch on Mordor ends. They just don't have enough soldiers to man the fortresses anymore, which leads us to what we just talked about, Sauron being the source of all this. All of this was happening at the same time as the signs of the arising of Sauron, and clearly he just wants to get back into Mordor. Yeah.
Yeah, and unfortunately it's going to happen eventually, because it wasn't just King Telemnar and his children, we never get the names of them, that died. The White Tree of Minas Anor also died. Now, fortunately, Telemnar's nephew, this is the son of Telemnar's youngest brother, Menastan, planted a seedling of the White Tree in the citadel. So good for him.
Yeah. Now, he also moved the seat of government from Osgiliath, which is now partially deserted, falling into ruin, to Minas Anor. Now, again, for those wondering, Minas Anor, which means Tower of the Sun, is what we now know of as Minas Tirith, Tower of Guard. And some quick word nerdery in this aside. Telemnar's name is Quenya, and it likely means silver fire, from telpe, silver, like in Telperion, and nar, meaning fire. Torondor's name, which is also Quenya, appears to mean king of stones, from the tar prefix that we've seen so many times, and the plural of Ondo, stone, that we also see in Ondaher, and Ondonore, the Quenya name for Gondor or Stone Land.
Torondor inherits the throne with Telemnar and all of his heirs dead, and he inherits the throne kind of young.
Yeah.
He's only 58 at the time of the plague, and it gives him the longest rule of any kings at 162 years.
Yep.
But it is a rough time to have that long of a reign. The plague has destroyed so much of Gondor's strength that basically it's all he can do to just guide them, help get them back slowly. But it's a slow process.
Nursing their strength. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's when we reach the final king in this week's episode, Telumektar. Now, motivated by the death of his grandfather Menardil, he builds up his military and attacks Umbar in 1810, wiping out the last of the descendants of Castamir and holding Umbar once again for Gondor, if only for a single sentence of the appendices, almost 400 years after the kin strife.
Leave it to Tolkien to just gloss over something so important in a single sentence.
Yep.
Having defeated Umbar, he then takes the name Umbardakil, which is victor or conqueror of Umbar.
Right. Though I do have to say the motivation of his grandfather's death must have been more about the stories that were told to him. Telumektar was born in 1632, so he was only 2 years old when Menardil was killed and his father Torondor became king.
Definitely feels like a legend born for
absolutely.
Sure. But
I'm going to go after the people that killed my grandfather, even though I was 2 when he died. Yeah.
Exactly. But that last sentence tells us that this victory, as many with Tolkien, is just temporary. Umbar would fall into the hands of the Haradrim about 150 years later.
That's right. In that war, the last descendants of Bill Ferny perished, and the pony was again held for a while by the barkeep. Don, what does Barliman have for us tonight?
Oh, very nice. We've got Haley in Michigan who writes in with a question that goes all the way back to Book 2, Chapter 4, A Journey in the Dark. She writes, when Gandalf was leading the company through the mines of Moria, it is clear that Gandalf, though confident, wasn't really sure of where to go. When they were stopped at one point, Aragorn told the rest of them, do not be afraid, and said that Gandalf is surer of finding a way home in the blind night than the cats of Queen Baruthiel. Who was Queen Baruthiel, and what is all of this about her cats?
Fun times ahead. For the longest time, the cats of Queen Baruthiel were apocryphal. They were fictitious, made up, imaginary, mythical, dubious, doubtful, unverified, unsubstantiated. In fact, in letter number 163 to W.H. Auden, which Tolkien wrote in 1955, he confessed, I had never been to Bree. He also talks about Strider being a surprise. The mines of Moria were just a name. He didn't know anything about them. And then he adds, I have yet to discover anything about the cats of Queen Baruthiel.
Oh, classic Tolkien.
Isn't
because
it?
In that same year, Tolkien wrote letter 174 to Lord Halsbury, where he says, I don't think that anything is referred to in Lord of the Rings which does not actually exist in legends written before it was begun, or at least belonging to an earlier period, except only the cats of Queen Baruthiel. In other words, there is a backstory for everything except her and her cats.
That's right. Now, the next year, in a draft letter, number 180, to a reader named Mr. Thompson, Tolkien said that there are virtually no references in The Lord of the Rings to things that do not actually exist on its own plane of secondary or sub-creational reality. Same kind of thing, right? Everything exists written down somewhere, even if I'm not including it in this story. But then in a footnote, Tolkien remembers 2 things that had never been written down. One was the names and adventures of the other 2 wizards, we're talking about the blue in this case. And then the other thing that had never been written down, the cats of Queen Baruthiel. I'd like to say, interestingly, that it had been left this way and that we know nothing. But actually, what we know is really fun. So in a footnote...
But wait, there's more.
That's right. There's always more. In a footnote to the chapter on the Astarian Unfinished Tales, Christopher Tolkien tells us everything that can be known about Queen Baruthiel and her feline friends. And I'm going to take the liberty of reading the entire footnote because it is worth it. Even the story of Queen Baruthiel does exist, however, if only in a very primitive outline, in one part illegible. She was the nefarious, solitary, and loveless wife of Taranon, 12th king of Gondor, Third Age 830-913, and first of the Ship Kings, who took the crown in the name of Falastur, Lord of the Coasts, and was the first childless king. So now we go back, folks. Remember when we said don't be too hard on this guy? This is why. This is why. So coming back to Christopher Tolkien and the note that he found from his father. Beruthiel lived in the king's house in Osgiliath, hating the sounds and smells of the sea, and the house that Taranon built below Pelargir upon arches whose feet stood deep in the wide waters of Ethir Anduin. She hated all making, all colors and elaborate adornment, wearing only black and silver and living in bare chambers, and the gardens of the house in Osgiliath were filled with tormented sculptures beneath cypresses and yews. She had 9 black cats and 1 white, her slaves, with whom she conversed or read their memories, setting them to discover all the dark secrets of Gondor, so that she knew those things that men wish most to keep hidden, setting the white cat to spy upon the black and tormenting them. No man in Gondor dared touch them. All were afraid of them and cursed when they saw them pass. What follows is almost wholly illegible in the unique manuscript, except for the ending, which states that her name was erased from the Book of the Kings, but the memory of men is not wholly shut in books, and the cats of Queen Beruthiel never passed wholly out of men's speech, and that King Taranon had her set on a ship alone with her cats and set adrift on the sea before a north wind. The ship was last seen flying past Umbar under a sickle moon with a cat at the masthead and another as a figurehead on the prow.
Oh my gosh.
So I'm perfectly okay with Taranon dying as the first childless king. I'm like, I get that, man.
Yeah, I get that too. It's rough. It's very rough. But
wow,
Alan.
Yeah.
As you, I am sure, are aware, there is more.
There usually is, yes.
Mm-hmm. In Hamilton Skull's Reader's Companion, they quote an interview that Tolkien gave in New Worlds in 1966. I don't really know anything certain about Beruthiel, though, oddly enough, I have the notion that she was the wife of one of the ship kings of Pelargir. She loathed the smell of the sea and fish and the gulls. Later, he says that she went back to live in the inland city and went to the bad, or returned to it. She was a black Númenorian in origin, I guess. She was one of those people who loathed cats, but cats will jump on them and follow them about. You know how sometimes they pursue people who hate them? I'm afraid she took to torturing them for her amusement. But she kept some and used them, trained them to go on evil errands by night, to spy on her enemies, or to terrify them. Oh my God, that's horrifying.
That is terrifying. I'll also say she must be pretty skilled with cats, because I can't train my cat to do anything.
Nope.
So training them to like spy on people and come back with news, that's pretty impressive stuff.
Are we sure that Queen Beruthiel isn't just a Sauron disguise?
I know, seriously. I mean, she's nasty. A black Númenorian origin, so she's already descended from the Kingsmen. What did Taranon marry her for? Was this maybe some attempt at sort of trying to heal the rift between Umbar and Gondor? I don't know.
Who's to say? Maybe we'll find a note 20 years from now in a desk from Tolkien's that was lost.
But I'll tell you what, sending her on a ship set adrift. I love it. Like, see ya. Bye. Don't let the door hit you in the butt on the way out.
This is a divorce in Middle-earth. Farewell.
Oh, man. And yet, so even though in historical terms, they erased her name from the Book of the Kings, right? She never existed. It's sort of like we'll never speak of this again. And yet, because of the legend of her cats, it's never passed completely out of men's speech. Like, nobody knows anything about Beruthiel because there's nothing written about her in the Book of the Kings, because she was a terrible person. But we all know about her cats. There's this little textual ruin of the cats. I absolutely think that's so fascinating, so much fun, and just shows once again the depth to which Tolkien creates this world. Yeah.
And the depth with which I think he really hated cats, to be honest.
Well, I know he hated at least Siamese cats, because there's a letter where he's asked about basically can these people name the litter of cats after Tolkien's, some of the character names. And he says, don't tell them this, but, basically Siamese cats are the fauna of Mordor.
Oops.
Now, I don't know whether he thinks that about other cats. I have no idea. But, we also know that the predecessor to Sauron was Tevildo, a giant cat.
Yeah.
And that the best animal in all of the Legendarium was Huon, the dog. So,
yes,
it's
the best animal.
The best of the best boys ever. Yeah. All right. Well, folks, that does wrap it up for another episode of the Prancing Pony Podcast. But please be sure to come back next week when we hear prophecy from Malbeth the Seer and Glorfindel the Balrog Killer.
This one's going to be good. Alan and I do want to thank the members of Team PPP, editor Jordan Rannells, Barleyman Becca Davis, social media manager Casey Hilsey, event and Patreon coordinator Katie McKenna, graphic artist Megan Collins, and website guru Phil Dean.
Now, please take a minute to check out the prancingponypodcast.com. That's where you'll find show notes, outtakes, Prancing Pony Ponderings, our online storefront where you can get PPP merch, including all the amazing episode artwork that Megan's been working on for the Prancing Pony Podcast for the last 2+ seasons.
You'll also want to visit our library page. The Prancing Pony Podcast is, after all, a podcast about the books. So if you are interested in the book we've mentioned on the show, you can find a link for it in our library. You do get a small amount of compensation when you make that purchase, and we do thank you for that.
Indeed, we do. And we also want to thank our patrons at the Kierdance contribution tier. I'll start with Demay in Alaska, Chad in Texas, Lance in New Jersey, Paul in Colorado, Joseph in Michigan, Kathy from North Carolina, Carlos in California, Brian in the UK, Jerry from Washington, Joe in Washington, Erwin from the Netherlands, Ben in Minnesota, Anthony in Texas, Karen in the UK, June in Ireland, Zaksu in Illinois, Sarah in New Jersey, Joshua in Massachusetts, Lucy in Texas, and Keith in Alabama.
There's also Erica in Texas, Carson in Oklahoma, Vivian in California, James in Massachusetts, Anne in Kentucky, Sean in New Jersey, Mason in California, Maureen from Massachusetts, Olivia in London, Robert in Arizona, Nick in Wisconsin, Lewis in South Carolina, Thomas in Germany, Craig in California, Bailey in Texas, Kevin in Massachusetts, Julie in Washington, Bruce in California, and Joe in Maryland. Thank you all very much for the support.
Indeed. Thank you.
Also, make sure you don't miss any episodes of the Prancing Pony Podcast. You can subscribe now through Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or your favorite podcasting app.
And one last thing, as always, don't forget to send your thoughts, comments, and most of all, your precious stones for Gondorian kids to play with. I mean, come on, you gotta have something to do. To Barliman at theprancingponypodcast.com.
And if you want your voice literally heard, well, just send us audio of your questions. Visit podinbox.com/prancingponypod and record your questions for us. Please, though, be sure to still email questions to Barliman.
Correct. Now, even though Barliman's been a lot more reliable these last few years, there is still a lot of mail to sort through. We'll try to get to you just as soon as we're able. As always, this has been far too short a time to spend among such excellent and admirable listeners. But until next time.
I have been Don Marshall, the obscure Lord of the Rings facts guy, and this has been the Man of the West with not a kin strife in sight, because I will be back next week, Alan Sisto.